good. You're good. Committee will come to order. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. As you know, our committee has been focused on working through a regular legislative order to advance member-driven solutions that deliver results for the American people. We're continuing that work today with the consideration of several important health, tax, and Social Security bills. We'll start with our two health care bills, both of which are bipartisan. First is H.R. 5659, the Esrd Choice Act by Congressman Jason Smith. This legislation expands access to high-quality, affordable health coverage options for Americans suffering from serious kidney illness. It removes a harmful federal restriction that has, for far too long, blocked patients with end-stage renal disease from enrolling in Medicare Advantage plans. Our second health care bill is H.R. 5713, the Sustaining Health Care Integrity and Fair Treatment Act by Health Subcommittee Chairman Pat Tiberi. This legislation takes two key actions, provides essential regulatory relief to long-term care hospitals, and it closes a program integrity loophole that makes Medicare, Medicaid, and CHIP more vulnerable to waste, fraud, and abuse. Next, we'll consider H.R. 3608, bipartisan tax legislation developed by Congressman Tiberi, as Congress acts this week to extend Federal Aviation Administration programs and associated ticket taxes. This bill would resolve potential ambiguities in the ticket tax by codifying the current IRS practice regarding the treatment of aircraft management services. Finally, we'll cap off today's markup with H.R. 5320, Social Security Mail Act, jointly sponsored by Social Security Subcommittee Chairman Sam Johnson and Congressman Renacci. This bill helps combat the growing problems of identity theft, a crime Mr. Renacci himself has personally been a victim of, by requiring the Social Security Administration to remove Social Security numbers from all mailings and justify when the inclusion is necessary. The other Social Security bill noticed for this markup was H.R. 711, the Equal Treatment of Public Servants Act, bipartisan legislation I authored with Congressman Richie Neal. For over 30 years, Social Security's windfall elimination provision, or WEP, has arbitrarily reduced the monthly benefits of some teachers, firefighters, police officers, and other public servants. Today, over 1.7 million people are subject to the WEP's flawed benefit calculation formula, which can reduce their Social Security benefits by over $400 a month. It never seemed fair to me that public servants who earn a pension at work and also in Social Security, whether it was a second job, a summer job, a second career, that they should be docked in their Social Security benefits. And these are those who teach our children, those who keep us safe, those who race to our rescue when in need. So the Equal Treatment for Public Servants Act would have repealed the current WEP and put in place a formula that is fair by calculating benefits using a teacher's, firefighters, or police officer's actual earnings history. This bill is about getting equal treatment for public servants. However, it's become clear over the past several days that public servants are not in agreement about this legislation. We need the community to come together on what they can all support, or the consequences, unfortunately, is to see the current WEP harm people on a daily basis that frankly don't deserve being harmed. Meanwhile, we will postpone consideration of H.R. 711 until that agreement is found. I want to thank all the members on both sides of the aisle who worked hard to develop the legislation before us today. These bipartisan solutions will make a real difference in the lives of millions of Americans, and they are a testament to what we can achieve by working together through regular order. This time I recognize the ranking member for any opening comments he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are marking up, at least the schedule was, we were marking up 5 bills today covering a range of subject matters. The 2 health bills represent a number of bipartisan ideas on Medicare coverage for end-stage renal disease and Medicare payment policies for long-term care hospitals. Many members, as you said, on a bipartisan basis, have contributed to the composition of these health provisions, including on the Democratic side, Representatives Rangel, Lewis, Pasquale, and Crowley. We have a bill coming before us on excise taxes related to aircraft management services. This legislation begs the question of whether we really think that jet owners are the Americans most in need of tax relief. At a time when so many other major tax issues are looming, such as closing egregious loopholes for companies that ship jobs overseas, and acting on expiring energy provisions. And if I might just add to this, we have a number of they've expired energy provisions or will expire, and there's bipartisan support. They were not provided by mistake in the bill that we passed last year. There's been no action on those, and so it's curious, not acting on those, that the tax provision is coming before the committee, the present tax provision. Closer examination is warranted to learn who exactly would benefit from this bill. There were two bills scheduled related to Social Security. The first attempts to limit the use of Social Security numbers in mailed material from SSA to deter identity theft, an effort that is already underway by the Social Security Administration. So let me, Mr. Chairman, just read the comment that I had prepared regarding 711, because I hope it sends a very clear signal. It was introduced by the chairman. It would revise the Social Security's program's windfall elimination provision, commonly known as WEP. This legislation does include some useful provisions on improving the computation of the WEP, but it also includes other harmful provisions that would cut Social Security benefits to an estimated 12 million future retirees. This legislation must be amended to prevent these cuts in Social Security benefits for retiring fighters, police officers, teachers, and other public service workers. I look forward to a more detailed discussion. And Mr. Did you want me to yield now? Later? I'll be glad to yield to you now.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. I want to thank Chairman Brady for the hard work that he has put in on this issue. And let me give you a timeline. 28 years ago, I signed on to this legislation. It is a huge issue in Massachusetts. There are thousands of people in Massachusetts who invested in the Social Security program and met the necessary measurement for quarters that are required. The result, however, was that because many of them took positions in the public service afterwards, that they have been denied the routine return that other Social Security recipients across the country have received. This is not, I repeat, this is not something that was compiled and put together in front of us in short order. This has been discussed, as I've said, for almost 3 decades. It was a fundamental flaw in a Social Security calculation back in 1982 that brought about this dilemma. The result of which is, if you are a retiree in 8 states across the country who receive a public pension, even though you put in the necessary quarters to earn the Social Security benefit, your Social Security benefit is cut by 1/3. That's an arbitrary distinction, 1/3. And I want to thank the Massachusetts Employees Association, retirees, and I want to thank AARP and others. I would not sign on to any legislation that was a threat to Social Security. My credential as it relates to the guarantee of Social Security is unquestioned, and was tasked by Leader Pelosi years ago to defend the Social Security initiative when the suggestion was made by the Bush administration that they might examine the prospect of privatizing that benefit. I call this to attention today because this is an issue that I would hope that this committee would attempt to deal with and an attempt to speak to. There have been other issues that have come before this committee where people have argued that they should deserve a benefit based upon a miscalculation that allowed others to receive more. That is not what happened in this particular instance. The retirees in Massachusetts, Ohio, Texas, and New Jersey, Connecticut, and places like that, they met the necessary obligation for the quarters that were deemed necessary to receive and draw down the Social Security benefit. And Chairman Brady and this legislation brought us closer than we've been. The Social Security actuary sat in front of us at a public hearing within the last 2 months and pointed out that this was revenue neutral and that there would be nobody who was harmed by what we were undertaking. Now, clearly, we need an effort by those who are to benefit or might benefit to come together and offer a proposal that might move us forward in this task. It is a complicated issue, but not to miss the point that if you paid into Social Security based upon the same prescribed formula that everybody else did, you should be able to draw down the benefit. And I thank Mr. Levin and Mr. Brady for yielding.
So, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. We had 3 amendments prepared for 711, but they won't be needed now. Maybe 711 had the right number. We're lucky that it's not being brought up today in its present form. Thank you very much.
You know, yielding yourself just a minute, I'm not so sure we're lucky that the WEP lives on. I think it's a terrible formula. I think it hurts a lot of police and firefighters and teachers who don't deserve to be harmed. You've done a lot of good work. I was hoping we would number WEP's days starting today, but Mr. Neal and I and the supporters are not going to give up on this. We're hopeful the community can come together and unite behind a solution, and we'll continue that work.
But not harm 12 million people in the
Thank
meanwhile.
you, Mr. Levin. You're staying on message. So, our first order of business
You've
is
heard the
H.R.
message.
5659,
the message.
the Expanding Seniors Receiving Dialysis Choice Act of 2016. This time I'd like to recognize the bill's sponsor, Mrs. Smith of Missouri, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for bringing up the Esrd Choice Act. I want to take a moment to recognize the hard work that went into this bill and specifically thank Mr. Lewis, Mr. Bilirakis, Mr. Schrader, and Mr. Marino, as well as the Ways and Means and Energy Commerce Committee staff for their hard work and dedication to remove the federal restriction that currently blocks patients with kidney failure from enrolling in Medicare Advantage plans. Our bipartisan bill provides patients with a choice that all other Medicare beneficiaries have, the option to pick a Medicare Advantage plan. The vulnerable patients suffering from end-stage renal disease are those most in need of the affordable, high-quality care Medicare Advantage offers. Unfortunately, they've been denied that access since the program was created and have been forced to accept traditional Medicare. I'm proud to author this legislation and to continue our bipartisan work to finally give ESRD patients the same option to choose a plan that best fits their needs. ESRD is the only pre-existing condition that explicitly prevents patients from enrolling in Medicare Advantage, and it's time to remove that pre-existing condition. The benefits of Medicare Advantage should be extended to all ESRD patients. It's the right thing to do. The legislation helps ensure some of our most vulnerable beneficiaries can benefit from a program that has proven to improve millions of lives. This is just one of the bipartisan solutions Americans deserve, and these are the types of solutions I hope to continue working with the chairman and my colleagues in delivering as we work to improve our healthcare system. Finally, as seen by the addition of the sense of Congress through the manager's amendment, my colleagues and our staff will be monitoring the implementation of this policy vigorously. As required by the Social Security Act, we expect CMS to properly, in an accurate and transparent manner, risk adjust for these seniors suffering from ESRD under a Medicare Advantage plan. Before I'd close, I'd like to submit for the record 8 letters of support from the folks back home in Missouri's 8th Congressional District. These patients have been receiving dialysis for between 3 months and as much as 10 years, and they wrote me to offer their support for allowing dialysis patients the choice of Medicare Advantage. I'm pleased to work to advance this policy with my colleagues to help offer these patients more choice in how they receive care.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I urge the members of the committee to support our bill. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize Ranking Member Levin or his designee for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to Mr. Lewis, who
Thank
worked
you.
on this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Levin. I would like to express my support for H.R. 5659, the Esrd Choice Act. This legislation is based on a bill that I introduced for many years, and it is an issue that is near and dear to my heart. Since 2000, the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission has recommended that Congress allow beneficiaries with end-stage renal disease access to Medicare Advantage. These MA plans offer better care, coordination than fee-for-service. They can also result in low-cost sharing, which would be an invaluable benefit for many living with kidney disease. Under this bill, those who develop kidney failure will finally receive fair and equal access to MA plans. This is the same opportunity offered to every other person receiving Medicare benefits. Again, I would like to thank the chairman, the ranking member, the members of the committee, and all the staff for their good work on this important issue. It is the just and right thing to do. And with this, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman Lewis. The committee will now proceed consideration of H.R. 5659 without objection. The measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This time, I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Emily Murray, Staff Director, Subcommittee on Health, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after her presentation. Ms. Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Levin. H.R. 5659, the Bipartisan Expanding Seniors Receiving Dialysis Choice Act of 2016, or the Esrd Choice Act, was introduced by Representatives Jason Smith and John Lewis on July 7, 2016. This legislation would remove the restrictions in place since the start of the Medicare Advantage program that prevent beneficiaries with kidney failure, known as end-stage renal disease, or ESRD, from having the choice of enrolling into a managed care Medicare Advantage plan for plan years beginning in 2020. In addition, the legislation streamlines payment for procedures related to kidney acquisition and transplant by providing compensation for all Medicare beneficiaries through traditional Medicare. In turn, H.R. 5659 pulls payments for kidney acquisitions out of Medicare Advantage and removes associated financial add-ons in the benchmark. Finally, H.R. 5659 requires the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services to provide a report to Congress by 2022 regarding the effects of this legislation on risk adjustment and related payments to Medicare Advantage plans for the added coverage. As noted on the green sheet, the Chairman's amendment would add a sense of Congress that CMS should fulfill their responsibility under Section 1853 of the Social Security Act to properly, in an accurate and transparent manner, risk adjust payments to plans based on the changes made by the legislation. Mr. Chairman, that completes my walkthrough, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Dr. McDermott, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm in support of the bill, but I do have a question which I feel a little strange bringing it up, but it's a glitch in the law, I think, that we haven't really thought about here. Under current federal law, are issuers offering Medigap policies allowed to deny coverage to ESRD beneficiaries based on pre-existing conditions?
That is correct.
That's correct. So if somebody has ESRD and they get into Medigap, or get into Medicare Plus, they then, if they want to get out of that and go back to Medicare, regular Medicare, do they have the guarantee that they can buy Medigap policies to cover the other costs?
Under current law, an individual is not able to, if they currently have ESRD, enroll in Medicare Advantage.
So they are trapped. Once they make the jump to Medicare Advantage, they're stuck there. They can never leave with the ability to get Medigap coverage for the additional costs.
Under current law, an individual is able, if they are enrolled in Medicare Advantage before they have ESRD, they're able to be in that Medicare Advantage plan. They're also able to leave that Medicare Advantage plan and enroll in traditional fee-for-service. However, current law does not allow an individual with the ESRD to also enroll in Medigap.
So they're stuck. Once they've made the decision to leave Medicare and go into Medicare Advantage, going back the other way is not a possibility. I mean, well, it's a possibility, but you have no way to cover the additional cost by buying a Medigap policy.
That is correct.
Mr. Chairman, I find that this is where the laws are all confused. Two different laws are operating here, and I don't think that's the intention of saying if you move into Medicare Advantage, you don't want to give people the ability to go back to Medicare, straight Medicare, and buy a Medigap policy. That would be the effect of this bill. And I think that at some point we need to take a look at that. There is a bill being written over in the Senate right now that has this in it. It is an issue. It's not because we don't want people to have Medicare Advantage. It's just we want to have all ESRD people to be treated fairly so that they can go either place they want. That's really what we're doing, is making sure the choice is fair.
No, I understand. Thank you, Doctor. Any other questions? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? There are no amendments. Questions on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of substitute? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Being the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 5659 as amended to the House of Representatives.
Questions on favorably reporting the bill H.R. 5659 as amended? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 5659 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House without objection. I ask the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. The members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Our next order of business is H.R. 5713, the Sustaining Healthcare Integrity and Fair Treatment Act of 2016. By the way, before I moved on to the next bill, I should again thank Mr. Smith and Chairman Lewis for good work on a bill that will help a lot of vulnerable Americans get the care they deserve. Well done. So the next order of business is H.R. 5713, the Sustaining Healthcare Integrity and Fair Treatment Act 2016. This time I'd like to recognize the bill's sponsor, Chairman T. Berry, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I do that, I too would like to applaud you and your leadership and Mr. Neal and his leadership for an issue that's really important to public employees in Ohio. As you both know, Ohio is one of those states that has a number of public employee systems, in fact 5, and this issue has been dogging many folks in Ohio for a long, long time, and the two of you have provided leadership like no one else has before, and look forward to working with you to resolve this issue. Thank you both for your leadership. Mr. Chairman, it's a pleasure to offer up a bill that provides regulatory relief to long-term care hospitals, or LTACs. I'm happy that the committee has come together once more in a bipartisan effort, and I want to thank my colleague and friend, Mr. Bill Pascrell from New Jersey, for co-sponsoring this bill with me. H.R. 5713, the Sustaining Healthcare Integrity and Fair Treatment Act, or the SHIFT Act, will give relief to all LTACs from the 25% rule. This CMS rule, which has been delayed for 10 years, allows no more than 25% of patients to come from one inpatient acute hospital in 1 quarter. My bill will reinstate the 50% threshold that was in effect prior to July 1st of 2016 and delay the rule for 9 months. During a time where patients and healthcare providers are facing increasing burdens and healthcare costs, I'm pleased that the committee has come to an agreement that will help over 400 hospitals across our nation. The bill will also provide relief for 4 specific groups of LTACs that treat highly unique groups of patients. And I'm glad that a number of my colleagues' bills were able to be incorporated in this bill. Those priorities include Mr. Buchanan and Mr. Pascrell's bill, H.R. 4650, Mr. Jason Smith's bill, H.R. 5559, Mr. Crowley's bill, H.R. 5614, Dr. Price and Mr. Lewis's bill, H.R. 5688, and last but not least, Mr. Levin's bill, H.R. 5723. The SHIFT Act will also allow the Medicare, Medicaid, and children's health insurance programs to limit reimbursement for providers or suppliers who may be exploiting the program, integrity loopholes, and engaging in fraud, waste, or abuse. This will prevent hard-earned tax dollars from going to what we call would be bad actors. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me the opportunity to present the bill today. I'm pleased that we're able to advance another bipartisan, paid-for piece of health care legislation through this committee, and we must always think about helping those beneficiaries that suffer from acute, long-term illnesses and injuries, and I believe this bill will do just that. I yield back.
Great. Thank you, Chairman. At this time, I recognize Ranking Member Lewis, or Levin, excuse me, or his designee for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure now to yield to Mr. Pasquale, who's been working with others on a truly bipartisan basis. Mr. Pasquale.
Mr. Pasquale, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for yielding me the time, Mr. Ranking Member. I was proud to introduce H.R. 5713, the Sustaining Healthcare Integrity and Fair Treatment Act, with my good friend, Representative Pat Tiberi from the great state of Ohio. As the co-founder and co-chair of the Congressional Brain Injury Task Force, I understand the important role that long-term care hospitals play in the recovery of many individuals who suffer moderate to severe traumatic brain injuries, or TBIs. If there's one thing that I've learned about TBI in the 16 years I've been working on this issue, it's that recovery looks different for everyone. That is why we must preserve access to all post-acute care options so patients can receive the individualized care that they need. H.R. 5713 would provide an additional 9 months of relief from the full implementation of the 25% rule for long-term care hospitals. This is particularly significant with TBI patients. The bill would offset the cost of this extension by implementing an important program integrity policy. I know this isn't included in the bill before us today, but I would also note that the industry has offered to extend the current moratorium for long-term care hospitals to help offset the cost of a 2-year delay. The length of delay included in the initial bill I introduced with Representative Vern Buchanan. It is my hope that when this issue comes before this committee again, that we seriously consider that policy to offset the cost of another delay. I urge my colleagues to support the bill before us today, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The committee will now proceed to consider H.R. 5713 without objection. The measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. At this time, I offer an amendment in the nature of substitute, which was distributed in advance, along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Emily Murray, the Staff Director, Subcommittee on Health, to provide the technical description of the amendment, nature of substitute, with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after her presentation. Ms. Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Levin. H.R. 5713, the Bipartisan Sustaining Healthcare Integrity and Fair Treatment Act of 2016, was introduced by Health Subcommittee Chairman Tiberi and Congressman Pascrell on July 11, 2016. In general, this legislation makes a series of changes that provides relief to long-term care hospitals. H.R. 5713 would modify the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2013 to provide across-the-board relief for 9 months, from October 1st, 2016 through July 30th, 2017, from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services 25% rule that went into effect on July 1st, 2016. This rule requires that in order to receive the full long-term care hospital, or LTAC, reimbursement, no more than 25% of an LTAC admission can come from the same inpatient acute hospital. Additionally, the legislation tightens current program integrity measures by providing the Secretary of HHS the authority to deny reimbursement for services by Medicare providers and suppliers within an area the Secretary has designated as a moratoria area due to fraud. The authority would apply across the Medicare, Medicaid, and CHIP programs. As noted on the green sheet, the Chairman's amendment would provide an additional year of relief in 2019 from Medicare's site-neutral policies for certain spinal cord specialty hospitals, as well as other technical changes. H.R. 5713 contains a number of other provisions that have been introduced previously by members of the committee. Mr. Buchanan and Mr. Pascrell's bill, H.R. 4650, that provides temporary relief from the 25% rule. Mr. Jason Smith's bill, H.R. 5559, which allows for all LTACs that met the 2013 moratorium exception to exclude site-neutral and Medicare Advantage patients who typically have shorter lengths of stay from their average length of stay requirement. Mr. Crowley's bill, H.R. 5614, that codifies existing regulations to ensure appropriate payments for certain hospitals that receive cost-based reimbursement due to their unique patient mix. Dr. Price and Mr. Lewis's bill, H.R. 5688, which allows for a temporary exception from the LTAC site-neutral criteria for certain hospitals that treat patients nationwide with brain and spinal cord injuries. And Mr. Levin's bill, H.R. 5723, that provides for a temporary exception from site-neutral payments for hospitalizations for severe wounds for all grandfathered LTACs. Mr. Chairman, that completes my walkthrough, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you. Are there any questions about the amendment and the nature of a substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Mr. Crowley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Mr. Tiberi and Mr. Pascrell for their work on this bill and the amalgamation of this bill with other bills, worthy bills, including mine, for consideration. I also want to thank Mr. Rangel, who has worked on the issue I'm about to speak about for quite some time and has a very personal connection to that as well. And that provision is a provision that will change the way hospitals like Calvary Hospital in the Bronx are treated under Medicare. Calvary Hospital is no ordinary hospital. They serve patients with very severe and advanced cancers, and they provide these patients with the palliative care that they deserve and that they need. And they also provide the families of those patients with the comfort, the resources, the reassurance that they need during what is the most difficult time in those patients and their family lives. They are quite simply a godsend for extremely ill patients and their families in New York City and the metropolitan area, and they have been, Mr. Chairman, for 115 years. But this kind of work and this kind of care doesn't fit neatly under Medicare and its categories of hospitals. For years, hospitals like Calvary have been classified under Medicare as long-term care hospitals, but they treat different kinds of cases and have different pattern of discharging patients. And so it makes more sense for these hospitals to go back to the cost-based payment system known as TEFRA. In 2013, we had a great step forward as that year's SGR legislation included language authorizing CMS to pay these hospitals under the TEFRA system. Mr. Rangel and I worked hard to get that in there, and CMS has worked to quickly implement that provision. But as it was put in practice, we started seeing all kinds of unforeseen consequences from the fact that these hospitals were paid under one system, but classified in statute as another. For example, because these hospitals still had their claims processed under the long-term care system, there were a number of problems and inaccuracies in the data. This meant that patients were having trouble getting their claims paid by other insurers like Medicaid or retiree health plans. Calvary Hospital was having trouble filing for their reimbursements, and the situation was getting dire, really dire for the hospital and for the patients and the families that they serve. I appreciate that CMS has continued to work with Calvary Hospital to address these issues, but it became clear that Congress needed to codify this change so that we could head off any future problems. So I am pleased that this legislation today includes this technical correction to clarify the status of these hospitals. It will allow them to file claims and be paid under the more appropriate Medicare process. And it will solidify the status of Calvary Hospital and allow them to continue serving patients as they've done for over a century. As I mentioned again, Mr. Chairman, I know that Mr. Rangel has a personal commitment to Calvary Hospital. I too am aware of many families that have engaged Calvary, as I said, during the most difficult times of their loved ones' lives near the end. And Calvary Hospital does such outstanding work. I think is a model for palliative care in the United States. I've expressed it to the President and to CMS on many, many occasions, as I know Mr. Rangel has done as well. And anyone who's come in experience with Calvary Hospital has nothing but the best to say about it. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you again. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Dr. Price. You're recognized.
Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry, Dr. Price is recognized.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Mr. Lewis for his co-sponsorship and lead on 5688, which is a portion of this bill. I also want to thank the chairman, Mr. Levin, as well, and Mr. Tiberi, the chair of the Health Subcommittee, as well as the sponsor of this bill, and particularly the majority and the minority staff worked together to make this bill possible, and the portion of it that we had a hand in specifically. I think what's being displayed here is a recognition on the part of all members of the committee of the uniqueness of every single patient, and that one patient's challenge is not the same as anybody else's challenge. And Mr. Crowley highlighted the difficulty and the uniqueness of treatment in the area of cancer treatment. For many problems in healthcare, for many patients in healthcare, the differences aren't that great. But for some, they're remarkably different. And the 5688 highlights the area of spinal specialty hospitals. And there are a number of them, the couple that are addressed specifically here by the criteria are Craig Hospital in Denver and Shepherd Center in Atlanta. These two hospitals, when you hear about a phenomenal accident, an awful accident, somebody gets incredibly injured and has an awful spinal injury, the likelihood is that regardless of where that individual is in this nation, they end up at one of these two facilities for their care, and the care is unlike any care that's delivered anywhere else. It is absolutely unique, and the challenge for all of us is to recognize that our job is to make certain that those patients can receive the care that they so desperately need. So I want to, again, commend the majority and the minority staff and all members of our committee on both sides of the aisle for recognizing the uniqueness of the needs of these patients, and I appreciate the opportunity to bring this bill forward and look forward to continuing our work on health care in this committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Price. Mr. Rangel, you recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to adopt the language that Dr. Price was using as relates to our responsibility to provide the best health care that we know, and also to my friend Joe Crawley, who really understood the needs, the special needs of the hospital that deals with the special needs of terminally ill patients. I could not find the words, quite frankly, to describe how you tell somebody that they cannot, that has found that someone in their family is terminally ill with cancer and they want to get into Calvary Hospital. It would seem to me, if I didn't know better, if someone's going to die, where they die would not be a consideration. But whatever unique treatment that this hospital has. It treats not only the patients, but its loved ones. And the loved ones are able to talk with other people in the same setting and realize they have the same crises and they're there to help each other. And so Joe Crowley has picked up the ball on this issue with the help of Republicans and Democrats and staff. But most people who say they're going to New York, they are talking about a Broadway play or to see Hamilton or to go to the Yankee Stadium or to stop by Harlem. But if you have time to visit Calvary Hospital, it is an experience that well people will remember for the rest of their lives, as they can see patients and their loved ones going through a terrible experience with the support and understanding that I did not know that health staff could give. So thank you so much, Joe. And this is one of the gifts in being a member of Congress, where the little things that we do can mean so much to people who are completely emotionally helpless. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no amendments, questions on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 5713 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The questions on favorably reporting the bill, H.R. 5713, is amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 5713 is amended to order favorably reported to the House without objection. I ask that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. The members have 2 additional days to file with committee clerk supplemental, additional dissenting, or minority views. I again want to thank the good work of Chairman T. Berry, Mr. Pascrell, Dr. Price, and Chairman Lewis, Congressman Jason Smith, Mr. Buchanan, Mr. Cowley, and Mr. Levin for very good work on important health care issues. Our next order of business is H.R. 3608 to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to exempt amounts paid to aircraft management services from the excise taxes imposed on transportation by air. At this time, I'd like to recognize the bill's sponsor, Chairman T. Berry, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this markup today. I'm pleased that earlier this week, through your leadership, the House passed the FAA extension through fiscal year 2017. In light of that, it's truly appropriate for our committee today to consider this bill, H.R. 3608, right now, this week, because it deals with transportation taxes. Let me bold and underline this. This is a bipartisan, bicameral piece of legislation that in the House was introduced by myself and my colleague from Central Ohio, Representative Joyce Beatty, and in the Senate, the lead sponsor is Senator Sherrod Brown, and co-sponsored by Senator Rob Portman. H.R. 3608 would right a wrong that has impacted hundreds, if not over 1,000 businesses in the United States, including in my home state of Ohio, which is a strong general aviation state, for the last 4 years. The bill simply clarifies that the tax on commercial air transportation, which is called a ticket tax, does not apply to aircraft management services for general aviation flights that do not use tickets. 4 years ago, the IRS Chief Counsel released a memorandum stating that services provided in support of aviation are taxable as if the services were transportation itself, effectively imposing a new tax without Congress's approval. The IRS said that the ticket tax applies now, going forward, actually not even going forward, to businesses that supply pilots, to businesses that supply mechanics, to businesses that supply maintenance, to businesses that provide scheduling services and navigation services, many of which are small businesses, and other services that are needed for general aviation flights, but don't supply the aircraft along with those services. These are small businesses. For decades, it's been clear, and Congress has specifically noted that commercial aviation is required to pay the ticket tax, while general aviation pays the fuel tax. However, the Chief Counsel of the IRS ignored this and seeks to impose a new tax where Congress expressly chose not to apply one. We have been working with the IRS for the past 4 years in a bipartisan, bicameral basis to try to explain to them, but the IRS has refused to admit their mistake and withdraw their opinion. So this bill will restore congressional intent, right the wrong. This is a simple bill expressing congressional intent that the IRS doesn't have the ability to impose a tax, and so that we can move forward on a parallel track as the FAA extension moves along this week. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your leadership. I yield back.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize Ranking Member Levin or his designee for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've tried to figure out exactly to whom this applies. As we understand it, it would permanently exempt from the federal excise tax that Mr. T. Berry has mentioned, paid by aircraft owners to third-party companies to manage and maintain their private planes, jet or otherwise. Mr. Chairman, I raised in my general opening statement the issue why we're raising this when there doesn't seem to be any immediate problem, when there's been a failure to undertake action on some energy tax credits that were omitted from the 16 appropriations bill by mistake. And why, if we're having a session like this, we're not acting on those provisions. We extended long-term for varying portions of the next year's energy tax credits, and we were right to do that for wind and solar. But as we all know, we did not extend the provisions that expire the end of this year that support investments in fuel cells, in micro turbines, in geothermal, hydropower, biomass. And I just want to raise this issue because there's been a failure. It was hopeful that it might be attached to the FAA bill, that it might be attached to other bills. There's now uncertainty whether there'll be an extender bill. So instead of acting on those issues, and by the way, there's legislation on this subject from 2 Republican members of this committee. So instead of taking up those bills and other bills that relate to this, we're today voting on a bill relating to the management of airplanes that are essentially owned by certain people and I guess leased out through management companies to other people. So I don't know if you want to respond to this, but we need to. It's already July. We're not going to be here for very many days in September, I guess not in October at all. And so when in the world are we going to take up bills like I mentioned that vitally need action and instead be taking up this bill when at this juncture there's no immediate need for action? I mean, the IRS has essentially withdrawn its application of this provision for a number of years. They haven't applied it. Well, if they have or not, you can clarify that. But do clarify why in the world we haven't acted on the extension of these renewable energy tax credits that are so vital and that everybody acknowledges they were left out by mistake. So if there's a mistake on this bill, there's an even a greater mistake in terms of these larger renewable energy provisions. I yield back.
Thank you. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 3608. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This time, I offer an amendment in the nature of substitute, which was distributed in advance along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in nature of substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Tom Barthold, Chief of Staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Barthold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Levin, the members of the committee have before them two joint committee documents, JCX 65 and 66, which describe H.R. 3608 and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. By way of brief background, some aircraft owners will contract with management service companies for maintenance and support of their aircraft or flights support related to that aircraft. This legislation exempts these payments related to the maintenance and management of the aircraft from the federal air ticket tax imposed on transportation of persons and property. The chairman's amendment, the nature of a substitute, in addition to making some clerical amendments, clarifies that in the case of an aircraft owner that is wholly owned by another person, such as a limited liability company that may be interposed between a sole owner of an aircraft for reasons of insurance liability or other reasons, that payment by the owner of the entity is deemed to be payment by the owner of the aircraft for purpose of satisfying regulations under excise tax collection. That concludes my description of the legislation before you. I'd be happy to answer any questions that the members might have.
Thank you. Are there any questions about the amendment in nature substitute?
Questions.
Mr. Rangel, you're recognized.
Economic emergency that our nation's going through. Could you tell me what wrong we are correcting with this legislation? I assume we're talking about services that are provided to people who own jets and other airplanes that provide services to them.
Mr. Barthold, if
are we
you would.
taxing them now, and why are we now exempting them from any tax?
Yes, if you would address just the tax provisions of this.
Yeah, Mr. Rangel, I think the issue here is actually the clarity of the law. A note that Mr. Teaberry made is there are fuels taxes applied to general aviation, and ticket taxes generally apply to travel by ticketed travel to persons such as myself. And this clarifies on what side of the line certain payments related to by aircraft owners to people that provide services for the aircraft do they fall? Is the travel on that aircraft subject to fuel, the general aviation fuels taxes, or does it fall on the line of being commercial aviation subject to the ticket tax? The type of services that you inquired about relate to it could be rental of a hangar space. It can be a provision of maintenance and upkeep on the plane. It can also include provision of a pilot.
Let's retry this once again and get this out of the way. In New York City, which is a hub for many airlines, we have a lot of problems with the cost of airline travel. We also have quite a few people who own their own jets, corporations, politicians, candidates, and they also have their plane and their flights maintained by private companies. Now, what is there to clarify? They don't pay anything now because they own their own plane, and the people who provide the services are being taxed by commercial taxes on other planes?
No, Mr. Engel, what I was trying to clarify before is the Aviation Trust Fund is funded by a series of different taxes. There are taxes on fuels, there are taxes on ticketed passengers, there's taxes on property,
How about the guy that owns his own private plane? Is he paying taxes?
An individual who owns his own private plane for pleasure flights would be generally paying 18.3 cents per gallon on aviation gasoline.
What about for business flights? I mean, is this...
If it were again a business flight and I owned it and it's part of my business, it would again be considered general aviation because I'm not offering my services to hire to take another passenger. So again,
and if he uses it for political purposes,
if the individual again, political purpose would be the same as pleasure flying in the world of aviation fuels.
How would this bill affect that person's tax situation?
Well, as I was trying to explain, it tries to clarify in the somewhat narrow case where the owner of the plane contracts with another person for certain services, such as hangar services or maintenance on the aircraft, but the person perhaps flies the plane himself, then that person would be subject to the fuels tax as I just described.
Mr. Chairman, I have no idea who's going to benefit from this bill.
Will the gentleman yield? I will tell you.
I'm talking to the chairman right now, though.
Okay.
I'll be glad to.
I'll be happy to help.
Yeah. But I have some people in New York City that fly these jets, and they don't deserve any breaks at all. And I see the word exemption, and it's not clear whether it's covering the people I'm thinking about at these private airports. And I don't recall having a hearing on this or a memo on this. And maybe I should have known, and somebody on the committee, if I missed the meeting where this was discussed. But this seems like an emergency situation, and I don't know what the emergency is.
Thank you, Mr. Rangel. Mr. Teaberry, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I should have realized that a sweep of bipartisanship couldn't last the entire day. So let me ask you, Mr. Barthold, of this question. Until 2012, did the IRS, under law, federal tax law, collect a ticket tax from individuals who owned management services that provided services such as maintenance, navigation, and other sorts of services provided to airline owners?
Mr. Teaberry, if I could give a slightly more expansive answer.
That's fine.
Yes or no. I think what you're alluding to is that in 2012, the Chief Counsel's Office was asked for advice in terms of certain business arrangements. And
Correct.
in 2012, the Chief Counsel offered advice suggesting that certain business arrangements involving management services, it argued, should be subject to the ticket tax because it viewed them as akin to a charter flight.
But these weren't owners of aircrafts, excuse me. I just want to try to get to Mr. Engel's point.
The company itself was not the owner of the aircraft. That is correct.
Okay, so what we're talking about here, just so everyone is clear, we are not talking about owners of airplanes. We're talking about owners of services. Some are small businesses that provide services to the airline owner or the owner of the aircraft.
Correct. That's correct, Mr. Teaberry.
So this has nothing to do with Mr. Johnson, who's a pilot and owns an airline, and exempting him from any sort of tax.
It's not about, per se, exempting anybody completely from the taxes that fund the Airport and Airways Trust Fund, because as I noted, there are fuels taxes.
That's a different issue.
Ticket tax.
So, for instance, I'm going to read into the record, XL Air, which is a New York, Long Island-based company, okay? This is a New York company, XL Air, And I want to read to you what they say into the record. In fact, I'm going to submit the entire letter into the record. We develop and enforce safety standards and practices. This is not transportation per se, and the FAA has never regarded it as such. Our issue is not with the FAA, but the IRS, our committee of jurisdiction. The IRS is attempting, against a 40-plus years of clear legislative history, to impose a ticket tax on general aviation flights that occur on aircraft under our management. And if these flights constituted commercial aviations, these flights have always been taxable under federal fuel tax. They are for this legislation. Another company called Landmark, which has over 2,000 employees, writes, and I'd like to submit this for the record. This is a Teterboro, New Jersey company. They have 2,000 employees. This potential outcome would be devastating to Landmark Aviation and our 2,000 employees. These are companies that provide services. Many of them are small business owners, and the rule, the memo, is providing a ton of unclear advice going forward. That's what we've been trying to resolve in a bipartisan, bicameral way for the last 3.5 years with Senator Sherrod Brown, your friend and mine, Representative Joyce Beatty. So this isn't some sort of nefarious work here. This is about providing clarity to small businesses all over America who do business in aviation. I yield back.
Thank you.
I want to make this bipartisan.
It already is.
Gentleman from Ohio controls the time.
I'll yield to the gentleman from New York City.
If I own the plane and I turn it over to one of these people who no longer would have the tax, do not I receive the benefit of the relaxation of the tax on the person that takes care of my private?
Through legislative history, the person who is maintaining the airline or the navigation has not been taxed. The person who flies the plane, there's a fuel tax. That's the point we made earlier. We're not changing that at all. There was never a law passed by Congress that said we are going to tax navigation services or management services. Correct, Mr. Bartold?
That's correct, Mr. Teaberry.
But you're reducing my tax burden. As a jet owner,
We never passed a tax. The Congress never taxed this.
So how these people are going to be exempt from a tax?
They've never been taxed.
Not the owner, the person that provides service to the owner.
Correct. Congress in its history has never provided a tax.
But if I had a car and the mechanics, the ones that take care of my car and provide all of these other services for me,
Mr. Chairman, reclaiming my time. This is what this would be. Mr. Brady owns a car, and he decided to let me maintain his car. And the IRS just decided, Congress never did, because I'm maintaining Mr. Brady's car now, I have to pay a tax on maintaining Mr. Brady's car. I mean, that's insane.
Why?
Because we didn't do it. The Congress has the ability to do this, not the IRS.
Thank you.
I yield back.
That is the key issue. Mr. Doggett, you're recognized.
Well, I'm sure there's nothing nefarious here, but it is rather peculiar. Do I understand, Mr. Barthold, what you referred to was not any action of the IRS this year, but a determination by the Chief Counsel in March of 2012, 4 years ago?
The Chief Counsel offered advice, yes.
And at that time, the Chief Counsel didn't just pull this notion out of the air, so to speak. They were relying on Section 4261, which they read to include within this tax certain general management fees.
As we described in the joint committee document.
Yes, sir, and with reference to all those fees, and you made reference to the Aviation Trust Fund, is that a fund that is used to ensure the safety of airports, to build runways and get navigational equipment and the like?
That's one of the permitted expenditure purposes.
And so the purpose of this legislation is to ensure that that Aviation Trust Fund never receives any tax revenue on aircraft management services.
Again, Mr. Doggett, this is what part of the aircraft operation and the trust fund is funded under the fuels taxes.
It's funded
and what's
under
funded
several different taxes.
Under the ticket tax.
You referred to several taxes that fund it, but this bill would cut off one source of revenue from one type of company. That's the whole purpose of it, isn't it?
Well, when the plane is operated, it would be generally, it might be subject to the fuels tax. It could be subject to the ticket tax if it were operated as a charter.
We're not talking about the fuels tax. We're talking about what is referred to as the ticket tax, and a certain category of services would no longer be subject to that tax under this bill. And just to be specific about that tax, as I understand it, if you get on one of these discount airliners where you have to pay to stand up or get a glass of water, you're going to get charged 7.5% of the fare plus a flat $4. Is that right?
On commercial aviation, you're correct that it's, the ticket tax is 7.5% with a segment fee of $4, and the commercial airline also pays 4.3 cents per gallon for its fuel.
On the other hand, if you rely on a aircraft management service for a corporate jet, under this bill, you would not owe anything on those aircraft management services, which tax would certainly be passed along to the owner or user by any of these companies that Mr. T. Berry is concerned about helping.
That is correct, sir, but there would also be, if it were a jet, you would pay 19.8 cents per gallon for your fuel.
And that's what a commercial airliner has to do. They have to pay
no, a commercial airliner pays 4.3 cents per gallon on their fuel.
There is, since you note that disparity, there is already a disparity in our depreciation portions of the tax code, is there not, for corporate jets where they enjoy a benefit over commercial jets?
I believe that's still correct.
Yeah. But in short, these management services, which are not going to be used by the individuals that line up for one of those discount carriers, they will get an advantage written into our tax code, never the subject of any hearing in this committee. Never.
So the gentleman's questions are beyond the scope of the walkthrough. I remind you to limit your questions to those that are technical in nature to Mr. Bartow.
I believe Mr. T. Berry was just making contrary arguments that weren't subject to any interruption by the chair. But let me just ask you, has there ever been a hearing on this proposal before the committee that you've testified at?
I don't routinely testify at hearings, Mr. Doggett.
Well, you provide expert counsel, I guess. Have you ever appeared at a hearing, whether you call it testimony or not?
No, I have not, sir.
Okay. I think that's because there's never been such a hearing. This does, I think, add to a disparity that exists between the way corporate jets are handled and the way that commercial jets are handled. And it just seems very questionable why, at a time this Congress is doing so little on so many big problems, that we would be tackling this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bustani. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time to Mr. T. Berry.
Just for the record, you may have not been here, Mr. Doggett, when this came up during a member day hearing and I brought it up. Just for point of clarification for the record, Mr. Bartold, is it true that this bill does nothing with respect to changing the ticket tax or the fuel tax for private owners in general aviation or for commercial aviation? This deals with management services.
There's no underlying change in the tax structure.
Thank you. Mr. Bartold, between the very first Congress and the 114th Congress with which we are in, to your knowledge, has Congress, not the IRS, my next question is going to be the IRS, has Congress ever passed a law dealing with the issue that we are talking about today?
Well, I can safely rule out the first few Congresses, I imagine.
To your knowledge.
I don't. Well, I don't know the nature of the taxes, how the IRS applied the taxes applicable prior to the creation of the aviation trust fund.
Okay, that's
But
fair. I think that's good. I think that's good
general,
on the margins.
As a general matter, this issue was broached to some degree by Congress in the treatment of the fractional ownership of aircraft. And in that legislation, the Congress decided that in fractional ownership case, that they should just be subject to fuels taxes rather than trying to apply a ticket tax. There's
Correct. That was my point. Thank you for
analogy.
expanding on that. So, now, guys, everybody here, let me just be very blunt about this. I don't know what's the hang-up here, other than it's an election year. The IRS, not Congress, the IRS has started taxing something that Congress never did. That's the point. So whether you're liberal or conservative, we can have a debate, Mr. Doggett, as to whether there should be a tax, and maybe there should. And you should introduce a bill, and we'll have a hearing on it. I'm sure we can convince Dr. Bustani to do that. But the point is, and you should not be happy about it, because if it was Donald Trump's IRS or George Bush's IRS, you probably wouldn't be happy about it. Whoever's IRS it is, they shouldn't be making the law. That's the point. That's why Sherrod Brown's the lead sponsor in the Senate, not because he's some conservative ideologue and agrees with me about taxes. The point is, whether you're a liberal or a conservative, a progressive or a moderate or whatever, it's not their job. It's our job, guys. It's our job to do this. And for those small businesses who elect people, they can't go to the IRS and say, I plead my case, I'm a 40-year-old business and I've never paid this tax, and now I'm going to pay this tax, whether I'm a liberal or conservative. They come to you, they come to me. We're their representatives. They elect us. This shouldn't be about politics today. This should be about the people who are getting screwed by the IRS. And we as a committee should take back our jurisdiction and pass this bill. I yield back.
Are there any questions for Mr. Barthol? Technical in nature. Mr. Becerra.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Becerra, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Technical. Technical? Mr. Bartold, let me go back for a second. Maybe we're misusing the words management fees here, and we should be talking about taxable transportation, because those are the words that are actually used in the code. And what they refer to is the cost of providing transportation services. And while I think now it's been made clear, so in case some folks didn't understand, we're not changing the method of taxation, the various methods of taxation for the various types of transportation services provided. But what we are doing is we're talking about who pays a tax and how much. And so let me make sure about something. We're not talking about commercial airlines that you and I fly on to go from one place to another, correct?
That's correct, sir.
Okay, we're really talking about privately owned aircraft, like private jets, correct?
They could be, do not need to be jets.
Correct, private aircraft.
Private aircraft.
Could be propeller, could be jets, right? But it's privately owned aircraft. And the issue is, what part of the cost of owning and operating that jet or plane are taxable in the use of that aircraft, correct?
Well, I'd say, to use the words that you did, is when is it transportation for hire and transportation services?
Got it. And we've never held hearings on this. We've not heard from the Department of Transportation. We've not heard from the Department of Treasury and the IRS. We've not even heard from the owners and manufacturers of private jets and aircraft, or even the manufacturers of these aircraft. But we are planning to make a change. Now, let me make sure. The beneficiaries of this change, because there is a benefit, correct?
The legislation does hope to provide some clarity where there's been dispute.
right? It hopes.
Well,
and the clarity would...
We hope to succeed in providing...
Right. Yeah, and that clarity would be translated into a benefit to some of these aircraft owners or management companies, correct?
It would at least stop potential litigation. So,
Well,
yes, there should be, there should be benefit.
You have a $500,000 savings indicated in the bill. That's your number, right?
That's correct, sir.
Somebody's saving $500,000.
The estimate is, remember, we estimate receipts, and there is some lack of clarity in the law. Some service
will pay
providers
less taxes.
may be collecting tax. This would say you don't have to collect tax anymore.
Right. So someone will not have to pay a certain amount in taxes, and you calculate that that'll be at about a $500,000 cost to the Treasury, of $500,000 savings to those people
correct,
who own
sir.
aircraft or happen to manage the operational expenses for that aircraft. Of the 140 or 50 million taxpayers in America, how many do you believe would fall into the category to get this tax break to have to pay less in their taxes for the ownership or management of their private aircraft?
This is actually very hard.
You don't have a number, that's fine, you can say.
But we think there are several hundred aircraft management service companies providing these services for as many as a few thousand private aircraft.
So maybe a few thousand private aircraft owners and several hundred aircraft management companies. So of the over 140 or 50 million people in America who are paying taxes, the folks who get this benefit are going to be no more than in the low thousands.
It's
and
a small
it is a
part of
tax
the
break. Do you see an offset in this bill to cover the cost of this tax break?
We reported that we view this as a small net revenue loss over the budget period.
So it adds to the deficit because it's not paid for. And I think, Mr. Chairman, the concern we have based on Mr. Bartol's responses is, one, we've never had a hearing on this. Two, it's a benefit that goes to a minuscule number of people who can afford to buy jets or aircraft. And three, it's a change that may not make as much sense as some people would like us to believe. Maybe we should do some hearings on this before we start giving out more tax breaks. Are you back?
For the record, we did hold a congressional hearing, invited members of the House
Mr. Chairman,
to present their tax proposals. That's where Chairman T-Berry did that.
Mr. Chairman, was that a hearing where we actually had testimony on this other than by the sponsor of the legislation?
No, and there is no requirement for that.
I understand. That's how we make tax policy around this place these days.
This is a silly season, so let's continue with the questions. Mr. McDermott, you're recognized.
Mr. Bartold, I don't understand all this exactly, so I want to ask, if Mr. Trump took one of his jets and got his daughters and his son on there and said, let's fly to Cleveland.
That question is beyond the scope of the walkthrough.
No,
Remind you to limit your questions
It is not
to those
beyond
that are
that.
technical in
I'm
nature.
positing a possibility as to whether that would be a taxable event. Because he said originally, if he flies for his own pleasure, no problem. There's no taxes involved in that.
Actually, Mr. McDermott, I said if you're general aviation and you're flying for your own pleasure, you would be subject to the fuels taxes. And I should correct what I said, since I listed the fuels taxes incorrectly. For aviation gasoline, it's 19.3 cents per gallon. For jet fuel in general aviation, it's 21.8 cents per gallon.
And Mr. X, instead of taking the plane and shining it up and fiddling with the engine himself, goes to a management firm and says, I want you to manage this plane and have it ready to go and have a pilot here when I'm ready to go. That puts him in a new category, and according to the IRS. Is that correct?
Well, as I noted, that's an area of dispute. That was the chief counsel's advice. Said in some circumstances, they thought that could make you, by analogy, like a charter service. That's been disputed by some taxpayers. There's been some controversy, some potential litigation. This legislation would say, as you just posited it, the mere fact that you hired someone to do the maintenance on your plane was not akin to a charter service. They keep your engine in top shape. You would put the aviation gasoline in it at 19.3 cents per gallon, and you would go off and fly. That's what this legislation would do in that specific case.
So it would mean that I could, by having a plane, I wouldn't want to take care of it myself. I wouldn't want to fly in a plane that I took care of. So I want somebody to manage the whole thing and make sure that it's functional and everything's done. If I do that, I run the risk, and this legislation is to say, we're going to make it clear there's no risk. You can do that. So rich people can now hire a management service and have no taxes beyond the fuel tax that they presently pay.
It says that rather than the ad valorem tax plus the 4.3 cents per gallon fuels and the segment fee, that in lieu of that, you would be paying either the 19.3 or the 21.8 cent per gallon tax. It just clarifies which side of the line your arrangement would be on.
But it would make it cheaper for me to own my own plane.
As we estimated on net, that would probably lead to approximately a $500,000 reduction in receipts over the next decade.
Over the next decade. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Lewis, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The largest commercial airport in the world is located in my congressional district. And some very interesting discussion, and I yield time to Mr. Doggett.
Well, I'm so impressed by the passion that has been brought to this and by the many times that the good name of my friend Sherrod Brown have been invoked on behalf of his trying to serve what I'm sure is a important local constituent. I only wish that Mr. Brown's advice had been heeded on trade as much as it is.
Gentlemen's questions around the scope of the walkthrough. Remind you to limit your questions those that are technical in nature.
My question concerns the statute, section 4261A, which I pulled up, and 4262A on taxable transportation. And isn't it correct, Mr. Barthold, that this is not a matter of Congress failing to legislate on these subjects? The Congress legislated. The original authors may not have intended to include certain things like private airport management services, but the interpretation the IRS has applied here is not inconsistent with the statute. It refers not to commercial aviation specifically, but to transportation services, and then taxable transportation services are defined over in section 4262A, are they not?
Uh, 4262A defines taxable transportation in general as transportation by air beginning in the United States.
So we've got a statute that the Internal Revenue Service 4 years ago gave its best interpretation to. Since that time, collection of this tax has been spotty. If it had been fully collected, your revenue estimate would be far more than $500,000. And a choice is being made today as to whether to exempt these companies. I just think the choice would be better informed had there been a real hearing rather than only having the sponsor come and say,
thank you. The gentleman's questions are beyond the
scope
of the walkthrough. Thank you.
I understand that applies to those who question this, but not those who promote it.
Are there any other questions on the amendment in the nature of a substitute that are technical in nature? Does anyone wish to strike the last word?
I have a question.
Oh, yes, sir. Ms. Crowley, you're recognized.
Mr. Barthold, if a person owns a private jet and the owner of this private jet uses an aviation management company to service his or her private jet for his or her use, this bill would eliminate the taxes imposed on this private jet owner for this service. Is that true or false?
For the services, not for any fuels tax.
For the services. So we know from an FEC filing, Mr. Trump, who is very, very rich, owns his own private jet. The IRS interpreted that he should be paying these fees under this bill, these fees that paid to, for example, Ryder Jet Center, Inc. for $10,000 on April 22nd of this year. They would be tax-free, is that correct?
Excuse me, Mr. Crowley, could you just restate the last? I'm sorry.
Well, I don't know if you want me to go to a point of mentioning how rich Donald Trump is, but...
Gentlemen's questions beyond the scope of the walkthrough. Remind you to limit your questions.
I'm
those
asking
are technical in nature.
for technical purpose. I want to know...
That's not going to
No, but he was, Mr. Chairman, he was interrupted and couldn't understand the question. I'm not going to go further back.
The question's technical in nature.
This is a technical question. The question is whether or not the monies paid for the services that were provided, whether or not the fees that he paid to Ryder Jet Center, that in this case, Mr. Trump would have paid to Ryder Center, Inc. on April the 22nd of this year, $10,000.
Okay.
I'm getting to answer
think
the question that the fees he paid to that they would be tax-free. Is that correct?
Gentleman's out of order. Remind you to limit your questions. Those are technical.
Would they be tax-free? I'm asking.
Mr. Crowley, I'm not familiar enough with the arrangement that any one individual has. We have the cases we mentioned of fractional ownership of jets. One could be deemed to be the owner of a jet that they have chartered, in which case charters are treated separately, as we already noted. And then there's the case where your contract that we're discussing here, where you're contracting for certain services, but it's your aircraft and your flight.
I appreciate, Mr.
So
Chairman. I do appreciate.
I don't know the specifics.
Mr. Bartow, I appreciate your honesty and your candor. And Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the position you find yourself in, and also the timing of this bill is impeccable. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
You know, it is. This is the week that both chambers passed an extension of the Federal Aviation Administration reauthorization and the extension of a number of taxes. The reason I was encouraged that we had a congressional hearing, it was raised earlier, was I thought perhaps at some point it could move in conjunction with that. And I was really grateful that we moved ahead without any other amendments on the aviation extension, so I think the timing is exactly appropriate. Dr. Price, you're right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to commend the chairman. You did say, however, that this is silly season, and it is indeed. But I want to commend Mr. Teaberry for bringing forward this bipartisan piece of legislation, and I'm pleased to yield my time to him.
Thank you. I hate to beat a dead horse, but let me try to beat it one more time. Mr. Bartold, we are not, through this legislation, exempting anybody from paying taxes who was paying taxes before, but rather clarifying, because of the 2012 memo by the General Counsel of the IRS, what had been standard practice prior to March of 2012, correct?
We're not exempting anyone from taxes under the Aviation Trust Fund.
Can you say that one more time?
Said you're not exempting anyone from taxes in some form, be it fuels taxes or ticket taxes. There's one or the other in essence. There will still be taxes collected on air transportation into the.
Thank you. Can I go one step further? And that
I was going to add, and forgive me, that there is dispute over what was raised in 2012 about who has effective control of all aspects of the flight, and what side of the line that puts something on of transportation of a person by air as opposed to the let me loosely call it the general aviation side of the line.
Thank you. And just go a step further here from my Flintstone mind. So that dispute arose because of a memo, correct? Issued by who?
The chief counsel of the IRS was asked for advice, apparently as part of, I assume as part of an audit or an exam, so it was raised on a field exam about what's the appropriate treatment of this type of arrangement.
And prior to that memo that was issued?
To the best of my knowledge, that issue had not been raised before.
Thank you. The issue had not been raised before prior to the memo. So this has been standard operating procedure until this memo. The memo by the IRS then provided this controversy and uncertainty that leads to where we are discussing today, correct?
There's controversy, yes, sir.
Thank you. And so for everybody here, we have been trying on a bipartisan, bicameral basis to work with the IRS. Nothing nefarious here, Mr. Crowley. I even have a New York company right here, maybe even a supporter of yours, who knows, that is saying this is hurting their business. The uncertainty is hurting their business. The uncertainty was not created by the Congress, was not created by Democrats when they were in control, I'm defending you now, or Republicans. It was created by the IRS. And what we're trying to do today is provide some certainty to these businesses who've never been taxed before, who are providing these services. We're not exempting anybody new from any taxes. Mr. Crowley, that airplane you own, you can still fly it and you'll pay taxes on it. And everybody else as well.
Yield, I wish I had these problems.
Yes. So, Mr. Bartold, thank you so much for your professionalism, and I apologize for the pain that you've gone through today. I yield back. Yield back.
Thank you. Does anyone wish to strike the last word?
I have a question.
Okay. Is it technical in nature?
It's very technical. Now, look, there is an effort. I think we should try to understand what this is all about. If the management has major control of the airplane, if they do, then the argument is that the tax involved, not the fuel tax, should be applied, right?
If I can just elaborate a little bit, Mr. Levin.
I mean, isn't that the issue?
The issue is somewhat, if this were a charter flight, if what's in question was, is this a charter flight? Charter flights are subject to the ticket tax. And one way to think of what the Chief Counsel's advice was in the particular scenarios that they were asked to look like, they said that they thought that because of what they saw as possession of the aircraft, command of the aircraft, and control of the aircraft, they thought it made the contractual arrangement like a charter flight.
Okay, so I asked a technical question, you gave a technical answer. So essentially what the IRS was saying, that depending on the nature of the management function and management control, that in certain circumstances, essentially it was closer to a charter than something else, right? That's what they said.
That's what the Chief Counsel's advice essentially said.
Okay. Do you know whether Treasury has said anything about this bill?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't know of any public statement from the Secretary.
Or anybody? Has anybody in Treasury responded to this bill, either publicly or to you?
I don't know that Mr. Bartold would know that answer.
Forget about publicly. To you? Has there been any input from Treasury at all that you know of?
Mr. Levin, in doing work for the members, we speak to the Treasury, we speak to the FAA, we speak to the IRS about what is current practice, what do they do. That's part of how we derived our estimate for this provision of what's happening in terms of exams and receipts and what's the position. Are you rethinking this? So we have had informal input, as we often try to seek on behalf of the members, from various individuals in the administration. There's nothing official.
Is there anything informal that's been?
Well, that's what I was explaining, Mr. Levin. As part of our research on behalf of the members of issues, we very frequently, on an informal basis, inquire of, and in this case, the FAA, the Treasury Department, and the Internal Revenue Service.
And has anything been conveyed to you or the staff by Treasury about this bill on an informal basis?
In terms of a pro or con in terms of this bill, I can tell you that a question had been raised about the issue that I raised, that I said that the chairman's amendment, the nature of a substitute, seeks to clarify, is we learned from some of our discussions that there are sometimes arrangements where I may own an aircraft, but I own it through a wholly owned limited liability corporation for reasons of insurance protection.
But other than that,
protection,
Treasury.
so that's
I don't think
that's why
Mr.
we
Barthold is in a
want to
position
clarify.
to discuss support or opposition. I think he's trying to lay out the due diligence that they perform.
No, just whether in
these
Treasury,
areas.
beyond what you just said, is given you any
winks.
Nothing formal from any.
How about informal?
That's what I'm explaining, is we seek informally additional information to help provide members with advice and to help us determine how to best assess the revenue effects of this legislation. So yes, on an informal basis, I asked my colleagues to make inquiries, again, on a very informal basis, of people within the FAA, within the Treasury Department, within the IRS.
Thank you. Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Mr. Becerra, you're recognized.
Hey, Mr. Chairman. First, let me just say, I think it's important that the sponsor, Mr. T-Berry, was able to try to clarify that there's no change to the structure of the taxation program we have in place for transportation. And I think it's important to, again, recognize no one's being exempted from paying tax. But I should have known that. That's all it took. But what we are doing is we are reducing the taxation to some entities. And it's based on the fact that we do have an existing controversy on how we should categorize some of these expenses that are assumed by either the owners of these aircraft or the companies that help manage them and service them. And so I don't think there's anything nefarious going on here. It's like anything else in life. You want to try to avoid paying any more taxes than you need to. The difficulty I think I or maybe some other folks have is that we've really not had an assessment of this, at least not openly. IRS is trying to make a determination about where to land on this so we can let those taxpayers know how to be treated. And this bill essentially short circuits that process, that examination being done by those who deal with taxes and the tax code all the time, to the benefit of some and to the detriment of others. And obviously at a cost to the Treasury, to taxpayers, and at a benefit to those taxpayers who get the tax break, which is a very limited number of people because most Americans, very few Americans, own their own aircraft or jet or own a company that services those aircraft or jet. And so it may be a minor matter, and certainly I can understand the impact it has in certain states where you have some of these companies that manage or service these aircraft, and we should try to get IRS to clarify this controversy. But to just short-circuit the process and come out with some winners and some losers is probably not the best way to make tax policy. And so, Mr. Chairman, this is one of those bills where chances are through some hearings or certainly some further information from the IRS, we could have a better assessment about where really to go with this rather than just short-circuit the process and end up with some winners and some losers without really understanding why. And so I think it's important to know that this bill is probably not ripe for consideration at this time. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Does any other member wish to strike the last word? Mr. Marchant, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank Mr. T-Berry for his hard work on this. Addison, Texas is in my district. It has one of the largest private airports in Texas. And I believe sincerely that this part of the code has created confusion among the hundreds of employers that employ thousands of people connected with the Addison Airport. And I think that this passage of this clarification will provide some clarity to these companies, clear up the confusion that has existed in the code, and I believe ultimately will create new jobs in my district, and I'm for it. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Does any other member wish to strike the last word? That being the case, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? There being no further amendments, the question is on favorably of reporting the bill. Sorry. If there are no further amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 3608 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill H.R. 3608 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. 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 Those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 3608 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill and that members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental additional dissenting or minority views. Our next order of business is H.R. 5320, the Social Security Must Divert Identity Loss or Mail Act of 2016. At this time, I would like to recognize the bill's sponsor, Mr. Johnson, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding a markup of H.R. 5320, the Social Security Mail Act. This bill requires Social Security to remove Social Security numbers from mailings. If Social Security believes including the Social Security number is necessary, they have to justify it, and they will report to Congress twice a year on their progress. Social Security makes a point of telling Americans how important it is to protect their Social Security numbers. Time and time again, they're warned to protect their cards in order to avoid identity theft and to be careful what they throw in the trash. For years, I've been calling for ending the use of Social Security numbers across the federal government. We got it done with Medicare cards, but there is more to be done. Last year, Social Security's Inspector General found Social Security still sent out more than 233 million letters with full Social Security numbers in them. When I asked the acting commissioner about it, she said Social Security was committed to removing these numbers from their mailings. But so far, that agency hasn't shown us a plan to do so. Let me put a stop to this now. Americans can't afford to wait until Social Security just finds the time to get around to it. This bill makes sure Social Security gets the job done. Americans deserve nothing less. Along with my good friend, Mr. Renacci, I am proud to have introduced the Social Security Mail Act to help protect Americans' personal identities. This is a common sense bill. It's supported by AARP and AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to insert into the record letters of support from AMAC and AARP.
Without objection.
It's my hope that this committee will favorably report this legislation to be voted on. Let's get it done. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. At this time, I recognize Ranking Member 11 or his designee for an opening statement.
I yield to Mr. Becerra.
Mr. Becerra is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me thank Mr. Johnson for the work that he's done on the various Social Security matters that we've had within our subcommittee. I do want to note that this bill instructs the Social Security Administration to do something it is already doing or in the process of doing, removing Social Security numbers from its letters and notices. The Social Security Administration has been on the ball and, quite honestly, is ahead of Congress on this. Social Security statements have not contained the Social Security number since 2001, 15 years ago. Social Security checks have not contained Social Security numbers since 2004, 12 years ago. The annual COLA notice that Americans receive no longer contains the full Social Security number on it either. The Social Security Administration is taking Social Security numbers off other notices on an ongoing basis. It could probably do all of these things at once, of removing Social Security numbers from any further reporting, notices, and so forth, but it would require Congress allocating some $14 million to the Social Security Administration to be able to handle it within its budget. Otherwise, Social Security is going to be asked to take resources away from other vital services that the service must provide to beneficiaries. Since 2010, the Social Security Administration's basic operating budget has been cut by 10% after adjusting for inflation. Even though its workload has been increased substantially, there are some 7 million more Americans who have begun to receive Social Security benefits since 2010. The only thing this bill does that the Social Security Administration isn't already doing is require the Social Security Administration to report to Congress twice a year for the next 6 years on its progress toward removing Social Security numbers from mailed documents. The Commissioner at the Social Security Administration and SSA's personnel have always responded to our requests for reports and updates. This statutory mandate in this bill doesn't hurt, but it also isn't necessary. We can do what we wish to help Social Security. Let's just make sure we're providing them with the resources that they need at SSA to get the job done. When you lose thousands of your personnel because of these budget cuts, when you lose the ability to move quickly on some of these reporting requirement issues because you no longer have the resources to do it, and when you're servicing more than 60 million Americans on a monthly basis who worked hard to receive their Social Security benefits, the last thing we should be doing is simply adding mandates to their responsibilities without providing them with the resources that they need. Let's not forget as well that the Social Security Administration has a $2.8 trillion surplus in its trust fund, money that is available to be used for its administrative budget needs, and to shortchange the Social Security Administration of the resources it needs to do the work well is only undercutting the services that Americans paid for and earned through the payments they made through their Social Security FICA taxes while they were working. So I think this legislation will help make sure that the Social Security Administration moves forward, but I hope this Congress recognizes that if it's going to mandate that an agency do something, the resources and the personnel have to be behind it so it can get the work done. With that, I will yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, gentlemen. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 5320. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. At this time, I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance, along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for the purposes of amendment. I will now turn to Amy Shewart, the Staff Director of the Subcommittee on Social Security, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask members hold their questions until after her presentation. Ms. Shewart, you may proceed.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Levin, members of the committee, H.R. 5320 as introduced by Chairman Johnson and Representative Renacci, seeks to protect Americans' Social Security numbers by prohibiting the Social Security Administration from including Social Security numbers on mailed documents unless the Commissioner of Social Security deems it necessary. This bipartisan bill requires biannual reporting to the Committees on Ways and Means and Finance on the status of the agency's efforts. As described on the green sheet distributed yesterday, the amendment in the nature of a substitute limits the period of time the Social Security Administration shall submit reports to the Congress to 7 years. It also modifies the bill by clarifying that it is the duty of the Commissioner of Social Security to implement the legislation. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my walkthrough, and I am happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? There being no questions, does anyone wish to strike the last word? Mr. Renacci, you're recognized.
I'd like to strike the last word. As a personal victim of identity theft, I understand how frustrating and concerning it is knowing that your personal information has been breached. Ensuring that all your various accounts are protected is no easy task, and in my case, took hours of phone calls to ensure that I was properly protected. Senior citizens should have the confidence in knowing that the Social Security Administration is doing everything within their power to protect the Social Security numbers and identities. I also, for my colleague, Mr. Becerra, want to make note that this bill is scored as costing $0. I believe that H.R. 5320, the Social Security Mail Act, is a step in the right direction to better protect the Social Security numbers and identities of our constituents. I encourage my colleagues to support this common sense legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Does anyone else wish to strike the last word? Are there amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? There being no amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 5320 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill H.R. 5320. All those in favor signify by saying aye. 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 Those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 5320 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I now ask that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill and that members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. The chair now recognizes Mr. T. for the purposes of a
Can I submit for the record the 3 letters that I talked about earlier during the debate in the previous bill for the record?
Without objection.
Thank you.
So ordered. There being no further business before the committee now stands adjourned.